This is a map, and you are here. You've been gone a while, but you're back. You don't exactly know where you are. It could be a harmless patch of land, the beginning of a mysterious trail, or even your brain. It could be all of the above too. You can't seem to remember this place, but its memory is always lurking somewhere in the background. You're searching for answers, and so you decide to move forward. As you're walking along this path, the first thing you stumble upon is what looks like a ruin, the beginning of a dolmen, what was once a passage or a grave. But you notice that this isn't any ordinary ruin in this mysterious landscape. You can already tell that it has been restored, improved by a modern touch. You can tell that this dolmen wants you to believe that it is an immaculate account of the past, a perfect rendition of history. The restoration of the ruin reminds you of the nature of memory in our modern age.
Here we go!
Our modernity seems to be defined by the belief that memory can be made objective. We have a boundless internet, smartphones that capture every moment, zettabytes upon zettabytes of data locked away in some archive in the cloud. We also have real archives, family photo albums and scrapbooks. We have childhood videos, heirlooms, museums, storytellers, films, music, media of all sorts, all custodians of our memories. We might think that in our privileged techno paradise, we have the capability of remembering the past as it was. Yet, just like the archaeological ruin restored, memories of our present want us to believe that they're showing us everything there was and will ever be. This is not the case. This landscape is no ordinary acreage. You get a hint that all of the ruins on this map will begin to undo the story that this first, renovated ruin has told you. There is no objective memory. In reality, things get lost in the current of time. In reality, memory itself is a ruin. As you continue forward, the second structure you come upon in the landscape appears to be what was once an amphitheater, a place of performance and mediation. Something about it reminds you of all the different ways that memory is transformed through media.
The thing that stirs our past. Memory ironically is the source of our regrets, while simultaneously being the premise for seeking pleasure and a vital component of our identities. It seems to only present the objective fact, causing us to pledge all of our trust to it. It is as if we deny the facade that memory beholds because we need something to lean back on in cases of uncertainties. The complexities that exist within memory's role allows for a nuanced definition, as being more than just the thoughts that are biochemically encoded within our brains, but rather to be extended in order to encompass the records we have of our previous experiences. This in turn invites notions of memory of the most general interpretations, ranging from historically documented events to personal journal entries. Given the myriad of methods available to record memories, it is helpful to talk about the advantages and disadvantages that each medium presents. To be clear, there is not necessarily a best way of preserving memory, as each method has its respective benefits and drawbacks, and the preferred method of preserving memory is certain to differ from person to person, given the nature of personal connections that lie within memory. It is just helpful to dive deeper into which areas each method prospers in and is limited in. Start with a simple question. How do you store your memories? The first answer that comes to mind is probably through the brain. In terms of personal memory storage, the brain is a very revered method of storing memories and holds a very unique position in its ability to record memories. The brain is a unique case in that it is physically connected to a person and therefore has significant credibility as a source of memory, since people are more likely to trust themselves, contrasted to other sources and people. In addition, biologically stored memory holds an emotional component, in that when someone recalls a vivid memory, they hold deep sentiments for that memory, since they are able to again experience the emotions related to the memory as they mentally replay it. However, personal memory also possesses some shortcomings. It is susceptible to both physical injury and mental illness, such as amnesia and Alzheimer's disease, impacting the accuracy and quality of memory stored in the brain. In addition, even without disease, not all memories are completely intact and may be difficult to recall without the appropriate stimuli. Humans have physiological limitations to memory, and when they do recall something, their memory only presents a fragmented glimpse of an actual event, and may not be very close to what actually occurred, but is special in that those personal memories present deeper meanings to us as humans, and are more emotionally connected, and that we even remember our feelings when recalling an event. In other words, one can feel personally compelled to rely heavily on their own memory, losing sight of the pitfalls that it can present. Diaries are another personally compelling medium. In a way, diaries can serve as a secondary source of a biologically stored memory, in that they are produced as someone is recalling a personal memory, and then physically translating that memory from thoughts to ink on paper. In this way, memories recorded with diaries are more static than memories recorded in the mind. Additionally, one can basically record as many memories as they wish to, and have direct access to each recorded memory, as long as they are able and willing to record them. Nevertheless, diaries also introduce their own challenges. For example, diaries are subject to physical destruction, being accidentally lost or alteration. Having an embarrassing story in your diary that you never want to think about again? Cross it out in your diary. Or better yet, throw away the diary. Storing memories in diaries also have less intentional consequences. Generally, a diary only has one author, restricting the point of view for a recorded event and introducing bias into the account. Videos boast a distinctive balance between emotional value and impartiality. They are vividly captured records that possess the ability to take us right back to the moment in which they were taken. These forms of memory embody several details that humans would not bother to take into account of their memories, producing a primarily impartial account of memory. Pictures and videos also are not tempted by human nature by biases, and therefore do not possess a particular perspective or preferred manner of recounting an occurrence, allowing for a more accurate account for a retold history. Of course, photographs and videos can be edited, but one is likely to notice if the original record has been tampered with. These mediums present the possibility of taking neutral records over time and of several people. Oral tradition entails verbally communicating ideas between generations and is often used to record culture and significant histories to one another. It is a more community-oriented practice than the other discussed methods, and therefore results in a notable obligation to preserve and pass down the involved memories. The community component immersed in oral tradition also presents emotional significance and a critical sense of belonging within the community. Consequently, oral tradition is also fairly credible to individuals, but not as much as biologically recorded memory. Just like biologically recorded memory, oral tradition is also subject to being modified if the generation passing down information accidentally recounts an event wrong, or if the generation receiving the information inaccurately interprets the information presented to them. Fortunately, such actions can be safeguarded by having multiple people passing down information and constructing a collective narrative. Nevertheless, when stories passed down orally start to contradict one another, the conviction to trust the stories circulating within the community begins to falter. Oral tradition is also reliant on future generations being invested in passing down the information that was passed down to them, and therefore can result in missing pieces of an account if one generation forgets part of a memory or decides that it is irrelevant. As would be expected, oral tradition also grows as time goes on, as a consequence of more people being born within the community, and therefore older generations must also make decisions on which stories are appropriate to keep and exclude for future generations. Computers present an interesting and intriguing juxtaposition to all of the previously described reservoirs of memory, but especially so in regard to biologically stored memory. Computers have several practices of storing memory, such as through a physical USB drive and a virtual cloud. Memory stored on a computer is essentially unlimited, and is very objective that such memories do not always rely on people, who are prone to take liberties with their own interpretations of an event, and can draw from a much larger data pool. Additionally, the remarkable storage capacity of computers allows their records to be incredibly detailed, and record events that oftentimes humans would fail to notice or be unable to recollect. However, memories stored through a computer are also flawed by their objectivity, and therefore lack of personal connection. These memories are much less likable than memories individuals have considerable agency over developing, and are therefore less likely to be trusted by an individual. Even while performing research online through a search engine, the anonymity embedded within online documents produces a lack of accountability of recorded information and therefore a lack of trust. Therefore, while storing information online is virtually unlimited, and in a practical sense, the most objective technique of storing memories, it is also burdened by fears of deceit when contrasted to other methods. All of this is to say that while there is not one superior method of storing a past event, an interdisciplinary approach is recommended in piecing back the occurrence. This would involve examining the event through the different mediums of memory storage available, and then analyzing them in hopes of reaching a reasonable and emotionally significant understanding about the actual occurrences of the event.
You continue onward and stumble upon a third ruin. It bears a striking resemblance to the first dolmen you encountered, but it is dilapidated, truly ruined and not yet restored. You start to notice the interior circles and lines that dot these stones. They look like neurons.
So now we can move on to thinking about memory from more of a neurological or biological point of view. So what I aim to kind of prove throughout my portion of this presentation is that if memory lived in the objective past, once we experience something, our brain would kind of process this information, and the experience would turn into memory that's fixed or concretized in our brains forever. If this were the case, though, our memory would not be receptive to change. It'd be composed of past memories only, and clearly this is not the idea of a ruin. What we're trying to actually explain in this presentation is that memory is precisely ruin itself. So what is a ruin exactly? Although the word definitely doesn't have any specific agreed upon definition, it is clear that in the archaeological sense, a ruin is the result of change, of degradation, of repurposing done over time. So the main idea here is that a ruin changes with time, and it's redefined and interacts with its present events, so it's not static. So coming back to memory, is your brain comprised of objective, unchanging memories? No, obviously not. Events that happen in our daily lives affect how we remember, what we remember, and even how we think about our past memories. So I'm going to split our thinking of memory into two parts. The first being that neurological memory is innately unreliable, and the second that memory lives in the subjective present. So starting with the first one, the best way to show that memory is innately unreliable is to look at the neurology behind it and provide a few concrete examples of things that can go biologically wrong. So the cortex of our brain is separated into two streams, the subjective/familiarity stream and an objective stream. And the conditions Capgras and prosopagnosia detail the effects of either of these informational streams going haywire. So people with Capgras have damage to the subjective stream of their cortex, and a good example of a result that comes from this is that they can objectively identify someone as a loved one, but don't actually feel emotionally attached to them. So in other words, the person seems objectively familiar, but not subjectively familiar. And the exact opposite happens in people affected with prosopagnosia. Another great example of the unreliability of memory specifically is peer pressure. So peer pressure is an excellent example of how long-term memory can be changed or rewired. So for example, a study was conducted where two lines of different lengths, one was clearly longer than the other, was shown to a test subject which correctly identified the shorter line as being the shorter one. Now, when other people were introduced in the test and insisted to the original test subject that the longer line was in fact the shorter one, the test subject eventually changed their mind and came to this new conclusion. So the test subject actually changed their mind in that their long-term memory was rewired to falsely believe that the longer line was in fact the shorter one. How did this happen? Well, through the activation of the hippocampus, which plays a role in memory. The hippocampus rewrote the memory of which line was longer, while the visual cortex changed the way the test subject's brain perceived the lines so that the longer one really did look shorter, which is absolutely insane. And finally in this section, we have the idea of synaptic pruning, which usually occurs during sleep. Basically what happens during sleep is that your brain prunes through the new synapses that were created throughout the day and gets rid of the ones that it deems to be unimportant. These are usually small or short-term memories, like where you parked your bike yesterday, but still we have no control over which synapses are pruned, which is kind of a scary concept and which just shows that we don't have control over all the memories that we retain in our brains. One final thing is that the brain can be really easily manipulated. That's because it uses just a handful of neurotransmitters for all of its functions. Often medical conditions that originate in the brain are treated by either amplifying or reducing the effect of a neurotransmitter. So often what happens here is that someone is treated for one issue, but as a result, they feel the effects of another condition. So a good example is schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease, both of which are caused by changes, irregular levels in dopamine levels, and so treatment for schizophrenia often causes the patient to develop Parkinson's symptoms. So this kind of starts giving us an idea of how innately unreliable the brain is and how it kind of does these things for us, like pruning our synapses that we have no control over. And now moving on to memory as a ruin and why it lives in the present. So memories live in the present because they're materialized in the present. They're both created in the present, but also brought back to the present when they're recalled. So what causes memories to be materialized in the present? Well, a great example of this are sensory experiences. So just as a little thought experiment, if you were to smell Play-Doh right now, you would probably have a few memories of your childhood resurface. Likewise, the sound of a song might bring back memories of a specific time in your life. Smell is actually the sense that can materialize memories the fastest and create the strongest link between past experience and a memory because it has its own olfactory nerve that is closest to the brain. So linking this concept back to synaptic pruning, although synaptic pruning may rid our brains of unimportant short-term memories, the creation of memory in association with specific senses transfers experiences into our working memory, which is our long-term memory, and subsequently a sensory stimulating event in the present can quickly materialize that memory back into the present. So the senses really are great at materializing memories into the subjective present. And we can kind of do a case study about this. So now that we have shown that memory is a ruin that lives in the subjective present, we can look at a case study involving Parkinson's disease. People affected by the disease have issues with their long-term memory, but not their short-term memory. So this already poses an interesting question and relates back to the fact that memory lives in the present. Short-term memory is easily recalled because its entire lifespan is in the present. Long-term memory, however, requires some kind of cue or event in the present in order to be materialized or live in the present. Research on Parkinson's disease shows exactly this. So, as a study states, for Parkinson's disease patients, their immediate memory response is intact while their ability to recognize memories from the past are inhibited. And also that patients also exhibited greater difficulty with free recall that required a preserved executive function than with cued recall and recognition in tests of episodic memory, where episodic memory means short-term memory. So in this case, cued recall is the event in the present that causes the materializing of long-term memories into the past. So this all makes sense. And now here are some childhood images that you might remember. Just try to think about them. They might evoke or materialize memories from your childhood. Do any of them kind of bring back memories buried so far in the past that you didn't even remember you had them? And so this kind of leaves us with an interesting question. Can we ever recall a memory out of thin air, or does an event in the present always have to spark the materializing of that memory? If not, what could this say about how aware we are of all the memories we have? Is there a way for us to be more aware of the memories we have, or the ways in which they're stored in our brains? We don't really have answers to these, and although this is not something that we decided to fully explore in our presentation, a mind palace is kind of an interesting way in which people can improve their long-term memory by creating a visual guide to store and recall information.
So as you wander on further through the site, the fog begins to clear, revealing some ancient stone columns worn away over many years. So you can tell that they used to belong to the same structure, and they will still look very similar, but you notice that each and every one of them looks slightly different from the other. One has a large chunk missing, one has a huge crack at the bottom, and so on. So the memories are the same. An individual event experienced by many different individuals might be fundamentally similar, yet all the details and specifics can vary greatly. And to explore this idea, we devised a little experiment that you might already be aware of, if you took the survey that I posted on Canvas. So with this experiment, we wanted to test visual memory of the same image and compare the responses of many individuals. So to do that, we first had to select an image, which was a bit of an art in itself because it needed to be a little unorthodox and ambiguous, but at the same time, there couldn't be too much going on because otherwise it would be too difficult to guarantee that people would focus on the same part of an image, and people might get overwhelmed. So a simple image meant that everybody could take it in a short period of time, which was important. So we created this survey to test out several hypotheses. The first one is that the memories of the respondents will vary, and that the second is that emotion will have a huge effect on how they recall the image. And 3 is that we would be able to influence participants' memories with the questions we ask. So the survey was structured with the hypotheses in mind as follows. At the beginning, each participant experienced the image for about 30 seconds or so. Then he went ahead and described the image, which was actually a bit of a time waster, because specifically made to be a longer question so that people have time to forget what the details of the image were. Then we asked them several questions about some of the details on the image. One of them that would be important to pay attention to is how many hedgehogs are in the image, because actually if you look at the image here, there aren't any hedgehogs. There's simply 3 birds at the bottom right corner, which look a little bit like hedgehogs, which is what we were banking on. So as for the results, obviously some answers were somewhat nonsense because some individuals didn't really put any effort into the survey and took it as a bit of a joke, and those had to be accounted for in data analysis and removed from the statistics. But for when it comes to hypothesis 1, it seems that all the results support this hypothesis very strongly. It's safe to say that it's visible from the graphs. And although it seems that the correct answer is usually the most selected, with the number of humans being 3 and the number of hedgehogs being 0 being the most popular response for the responding question, there is still significant variation in the answers apart from that. Even to add to that, some responses were completely unique to each individual. For instance, for the color of the sky, colors such as green, red, grey, yellow, dark grey to describe the sky were all mentioned by only one individual. So there was a lot of variety in all the responses. So hypothesis 2 was based on question 2 and question 6, where we asked the participants about the color of the sky and the emotions they were feeling. So there's not a lot of data, but one finding indicated some truth in the hypothesis. And that finding was that 3/4 of the participants that described the color of the sky as dark, i.e. dark blue, dark grey, etc., mentioned also experiencing an obviously negative emotion like sadness, despair, distress, mourning. So obviously it's possible that their emotional state affected how they viewed the image, and they obviously probably forgotten what the sky had looked like, but they still described it as a dark color because the emotion they were feeling was negative. I didn't actually count confusion as a negative emotion, by the way, but if confusion was counted, then 100% of students that described the sky as dark had felt negative emotion. And it's important to note that less than half of the students that experienced the negative emotion, as in less than half of the students that took the survey experienced a negative emotion. So purely randomly, this result would have been somewhat unlikely. So hypothesis 3 was tested with question 5, where we asked students how many hedgehogs were in the image, which was the trick question, if you remember. And obviously there was 0. And that question had the oddest responses, yet seemed to confirm the hypothesis. And it's clear that participants did not actually see any hedgehogs on the image, yet there was a significant number of people that claimed to have seen between 1 and 4 hedgehogs. Some obviously claiming that they didn't know whether they saw any. But it's clear that this demonstrates that because the question was asked, the students had changed their responses, they'd altered their memory or began to doubt what they saw, which is quite an interesting finding, I'd say. So now to the summary of limitations and takeaways. So obviously, we didn't really have that much data, and the experiment wasn't perfectly designed, so we can't claim anything very reliably. To an example of a bad design flaw is that to differentiate between memory difference and interpretation difference is very difficult. So we don't know whether the responses were varied due to students interpreting the painting differently to what I expected, or because they had actually forgotten what was on there and their memory was flawed. So to prevent that, I should have probably chosen a more objective image that wasn't as ambiguous, i.e. an image where birds don't look like birds as opposed to looking more like humans mixed with birds. Then onto the important takeaways. It's clear though that the same image can be experienced very differently because of the flaws in our memory. Secondly, the emotional attachments that we have with this image might influence how we remember an image. And lastly, that memories of an image may be changed by future information that we take in. So, for instance, the question with the hedgehogs had made some people doubt whether they saw hedgehogs or not. This is the creation of these new memories is known in psychology as confabulation, which is quite an interesting phenomenon, I'd say. And confabulation in psychology is when someone is when there's an error in memory and someone fabricates or distorts or misinterprets their memories, and it generally makes people very confident about the memories that they created, and they genuinely believe in those memories. And obviously, it's normally a disorder, but everybody to an extent makes up memories. And I personally have a little experience to share with you where I had run into confabulation. And it goes a little bit like this. When I was a little kid, I used to have a cat. And my cousin recounted a story about me and this cat that her parents told me. And essentially my cousin told me that when I was a very, very small kid, I tried to shove my cat into the bathroom, into the toilet. And I remember thinking, oh geez, I very vaguely remember that. What was I thinking? This is terrible. And I recall genuinely seeing myself doing it in my head, and I remember being able to replay the memory of shoving my cat into the toilet. And for many years I felt terrible, and I was convinced that it was that I had done such a terrible deed. But recently it transpired that my cousin made a mistake, and the story wasn't actually about me, but about one of my little brothers. So it turned out that I had completely made up that memory, but I felt like I had a memory so vividly. And it turns out that I just fell victim to the confabulation phenomenon. Actually, having seen the browser presentation got me thinking a little bit about how important it is to be aware of confabulation. In this age, where we get fed information without much consent through adverts or propaganda through the internet, it's very important to be aware of how easily our memory can be influenced.
You leave the series of columns and follow the path into a dense forest. Tall grass gives way to foliage, which gives way to towering, deciduous trees. As you move forward in the mist, you find a passage jutting off from the main path. You take the risk and follow this new trail into the woods before happening upon a clearing. This clearing has a singular column as opposed to many, and fascinatingly, there are multiple cracks that run through it, suggesting different routes to the same central chamber. It is the same visual memory, but approached from many different angles. Where Dave's experiment demonstrated a collective visual memory, I wanted to run a similar experiment on myself. But how? How might I consider the contingencies of memory not among many people, but for a single person? Then I got it. Sticky notes. For 11 days in a row, I attempted to draw the same image from memory on sticky notes. I was not allowed to consult my original image or any of the other versions, and throughout the day, I was also not permitted to speak about the particular imagery of my drawing. I also synthesized the image myself without taking direct inspiration from any other visual. Some variables were kept constant. For example, every drawing was done on a sticky note, each of which I promptly locked away in a safe location. I also constantly used the same black pen, and I only drew in my bedroom. And that's on self-quarantine. On the other hand, I did not designate a particular time of day to draw the image, which would have more evenly spaced out the time between each iteration. I hypothesized, based on our overarching thesis on the presence of memory, every image would vary for reasons other than my admittedly lacking artistic ability. I expected that each image would deviate in some important way, and that this deviation would occur due to faults in memory. After my 11 days were up, I found that I wasn't entirely wrong. It was also a lot of fun looking at all the ways that the creepy cat I drew changed over time. Here's a sort of time-lapse of my different drawings. So, what can we conclude? Well, probably not that I'm a good artist, although I can just accept being a bit In the end, I was not able to come up with a quantifiable way of discussing the level of deviation between each of these images, but it's fair to say that my ability to redraw the same image is not entirely horrendous. It's also not entirely magnificent. Importantly, many of these iterations resemble one another, especially in terms of placement. I was consistently able to spatially place every object, the cat, the trees, the sun, the wall, the window, in roughly consistent locations. Furthermore, I never ended up forgetting the presence of a particular object. Instead, I perpetually forgot numbers, the number of rays emitted by the sun, or the number of trees in the background. These observations illuminate my ability to retain information. While I may have forgotten surface-level specifics, I did not forget the superstructural qualities of an image. For example, I didn't forget the placement of objects, the categories of objects, or the rough shapes of objects. How can we explain the consistency between my drawings? Well, there are some more traditional answers. For example, I was the only one who made it, so of course it's easier for me to remember. And also, only a day in between each iteration probably isn't enough time to see a lot of deviation. And lastly, I was using an image with easily categorizable things as opposed to things that are abstract and less meaningful. But there's one reason for consistency I want to explore, and I think this is a really big deal: the actual process of recollection. After the 7th day of my experiment, I came to realize that I was drawing each image in precisely the same order. I would begin with the tail of the cat, finish the cat, move on to the brick wall, always start from the top right, draw the window, draw the trees, ink in the butterflies, and finish off with the sun. I had involuntarily split the activity of drawing this image into a series of tasks that were carried out in a consistent order, greatly helping me remember the placement of objects in the visual field. This phenomenon resonates with a much wider understanding of heightened recollection as processual. What makes the memory palace and other mnemonic devices so powerful is not merely that different ideas are categorized into visual symbols, but also that an individual can imagine navigating through those visual symbols. Recollection does not happen in an instance. It is an unfolding voyage that can tie individual ideas to one another. Like the presentation that we are giving right now, you remember something best when it's on a path. Interestingly, this development of an order was completely involuntary. Memory palaces are very much deliberate devices aimed at improving recollection, but it appears that I just so happened to draw the same image in the same way over several days. It seems that I was tapping into a level of subconscious memory, and these subconscious memories came about from my body. The drawing process became, more specifically, a habit of my hand. While I was drawing on paper, I was simultaneously etching an understanding of drawing into myself, into my body, like when you practice an instrument. This phenomenon isn't also something that's philosophically new. From a phenomenological perspective, the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty famously talked about typing on a typewriter in the same exact way. He stated in his 1945 magnum opus, The Phenomenology of Perception, "If habit is neither a form of knowledge nor an involuntary action, what then is it? It is knowledge in the hands, which is forthcoming only when bodily effort is made and cannot be formulated in detachment from that effort." Though there was a lot of consistency in my drawings, and although a lot of this is due to my development of an order, the spirit of my original hypothesis still holds true. Kind of. There is clear variation between each of the sticky notes. On one hand, at least some of this variation can be credited to momentary and spontaneous lapses in memory. It appears that I simply could not remember the more specific details of my image: the number of trees, the number of rays, the position of butterflies, the number of spots, etc. On the other hand, there were more gradual changes over time. For example, the position of the window got higher as the weeks went on, and the size of the creepy cat's face definitely shrunk. My giant game of temporal telephone was not just about reproduction, but also about reproducing things in a present that was open to change. My memories had the possibility of forever shifting every time I started drawing. To recall the memory of a picture, then, is less like reprojecting that picture and more like redrawing it in a palimpsest of what had been left from before. So, what can we conclude from all this? First, I'm not the best artist in the world, though this should definitely have been a given from the get-go. Second, at least in the scope of this experiment, we can think of memory on the orders of structure and superstructure. The more fundamental things in a picture, relative position and object type, are easy to remember. Third, we remember things better if they are in a process, and sometimes our body does the remembering for us. Fourth, variation comes in spontaneous and gradual flavors. And ultimately, I learned that memory presents itself as a present engagement with the past. It's not that everything is always different, but that everything we reproduce is open for negotiation. The act of remembering anything at all can in fact reflexively affect the faculty of memory. For example, drawing and redrawing was also a way of fashioning and refashioning my body's memory of that drawing. Think of this as a feedback loop. Like visiting a ruin, visiting a memory can forever change that entity, making it truly something of the present despite its traces of the past. You finally make your way out of the woods. To your surprise, you can faintly hear the sound of rushing water, and before long you notice a river. A monument in the shape of a triangular prism sits next to this river. You notice that this single monument can be viewed in 3 completely different ways based on where you're looking from. If you're near the river, you have the forest as your background. If you're in the forest, you have the river as your background. And if you're on the trail, you have a field of tall grass as your background. It is the same monument, the same memory, but construed in entirely different ways.
The subjectivity of memory can have serious ramifications on how people in the present view the past, especially because memory can be manipulated to paint certain groups more favorably. One example of this is the Tiananmen Square protests. The Tiananmen Square is located in Beijing, and its name translates to Heavenly Peace. So in the 1980s, the ruling Communist Party was divided between those who wanted rapid change and those who wanted to maintain strict state control, and this caused the start of student-led protests with demands for more democracy. These protests were further spurred by the death of Hu Yaobang on April 15, 1989, and he had become a symbol for democratic reform. In mourning Hu, the students called for a more open democratic government, and eventually thousands of people joined the students in Tiananmen Square, with the protest numbers increasing to the tens of thousands by mid-May, and by the end of May, there were around 1.2 million protesters. So people marched daily, and these events were broadcasted abroad to countries like the United States. And so the Chinese government became very uncomfortable with these protests and responded with increasing military action, resulting in Chinese soldiers firing at the crowds on June 4th at 1 a.m. Many countries condemned the Chinese government's response to the protests, including the United States, who later imposed sanctions on China. So let's look at how China invented the country's memory of the protests. At the end of June 1989, the Chinese government said that 200 people died. 2 scholars published papers on the event in 2001 in China, to which the government called fabricated material. Now, discussion of Tiananmen Square is extremely taboo, and any posts related to the massacres are immediately removed from the internet. When searching up the massacres on the Chinese version of Google, as no results pop up, China has written Tiananmen Square out of its history books, and it routinely bans posts and keywords that mention the incident. And so, of course, this alters the memory of the Tiananmen Square protests for the younger generation, who lack completely any awareness about the event because of the removal of any related information on all sources of media. Security forces are mobilized annually on June 4th to prevent public remembrances. And on the 26th anniversary of the event, money transfers made through the popular messaging app in China, WeChat, were even blocked if they were made in amounts with the numbers 64 or 89, because these numbers are references to the actual date of the massacre, which is June 4th, 1989. So as you can see on the left, users posted screenshots on Twitter showing that transfers of amounts like $6.40 weren't going through, and they got an error instead that said unusual transaction. If we look at the Western memory or international memory of the protests, we get a completely different story. In 2017, newly released documents from the UK revealed that the British ambassador to China reported that tens of thousands of people had died. And so, to mark the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protests, Secretary of State
Mike Pompeo called on China to end its persecution of human rights activists, in addition to making a full accounting of what happened on June 4th, 1989. And he said, quote, "We urge the Chinese government to make a full public accounting of those killed or missing to give comfort to the many victims of this dark chapter of history." And the Chinese embassy in DC called Pompeo's comments an affront to the Chinese people and a serious violation of international law. And they also said that the Chinese government reached the verdict on this event a long time ago, and China's human rights are in the best period ever. And you can also see on the right here that when you search up June 4th, 1989 on Google, you get all these images of tanks and protesters and things like that. But when you search it up on the Chinese version of Google, you get these images, which clearly aren't related to the event. And so, in conclusion, this matters because China's rewriting history. Tiananmen Square shows the dangers of the subjectivity of memory and the ramifications of forgetting. The event is an example of collective amnesia, where the Chinese generation today is completely ignorant of the massacre and they have nowhere to go to even find information about the protests. And the Cyberspace Administration of China says it's illegal to falsify the history of the Communist Party with dissenting content. So we can see how a government can manipulate memory and essentially hide mass atrocities.
One of the last monuments in the landscape is a series of pillars and crumbling walls, erected in the shape of a scale? How does our malleable memory interact with the law?
Judges, juries, and mental health professionals still have outdated views of memory, often with serious consequences. Memory wars involve a heated debate that continues to roil the criminal justice system and the field of psychology. Memories aren't a reality. Instead, our recollections can be shaped in a different way and contaminated, which is called the misinformation effect. Witnesses sometimes forget faces they had actually seen and create false memories of other perpetrators. Memory is more like putting puzzle pieces together than retrieving a video recording. Eyewitness testimony refers to a victim or bystander who is describing what they observed during a specific event under investigation. These testimonies are critical to the justice system, and they are perceived as being reliable by the jurors. Furthermore, police surveys indicate that eyewitness testimony is the main form of evidence in more than 20% of cases. However, it definitely has a possibility of leading to wrongful convictions. Witness identifications contributed to approximately 71% of more than 360 wrongful convictions in the U.S. overturned by post-conviction DNA evidence. Eyewitness testimony can be affected by many factors. First, memory contamination. Eyewitness testimonies can be malleable when eyewitnesses talk to other eyewitnesses before speaking to law enforcement. These conversations can lead to co-witness conformity. Also, memory decay can be a problem since months or years can pass before a case goes to trial and memories fade over time. Second is stress. Stress and trauma of witnessing a crime can influence one's ability to remember the details, especially if a weapon was used. However, studies have found that many victims or bystanders are able to accurately describe a gun or knife in great detail while having little knowledge of what the perpetrator looked like. Third is suspect lineup. Single photos are shown to the witness, and it is said to get less accurate result as compared to live lineups. Also, making the witness choose from the lineup can lead to false identification since the suspect could or cannot be in the lineup. The researchers concluded that the words police officers use influence eyewitness testimony regarding specific detail. Next is poor eyesight. Darkness, poor eyesight, and obstructive view and long distance may be factors in a witness's ability to accurately recall events. Next is cross-race effect. Everyone has difficulty recognizing individuals from other racial or ethnic groups. Witness bias. Eyewitnesses have preconceived notions about the type of people who commit certain crimes. Consequently, their bias affects how much information they retain about a suspect. Next is regarding the Ronald Cotton case study. It's one of the most famous cases of inaccurate eyewitness testimonies, and it involves the victim, Jennifer Thompson. In 1984, she was raped in her home in North Carolina, and another woman in her neighborhood was raped around the same time. Police believe the same man committed both rapes, and Jennifer helped with the creation of composite sketch of the rapist. Then police developed a set of suspects and created a lineup. Thompson eventually identified Ron Cotton in the six-person photograph lineup and chose him again in the live lineup, stating, "This looks like the most like him." Therefore, Ron Cotton was charged and convicted of the rapes and was sentenced to life in prison, plus 54 years. Thompson's identification of him was the biggest factor in determining his guilt. After serving more than 10 years in prison, Cotton was exonerated due to the DNA testing that determined that Cotton was not the perpetrator. The case became a go-to example of how eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. Thompson later on stated, "I was certain, but I was wrong." So, because of these cases that are frequently occurring right now, there is something called an Innocent Project, which is a nonprofit legal organization that tries to free the staggering number of innocent people who remain incarcerated and to bring reform to the system responsible for their unjust imprisonments. The organization suggested methods to improve the accuracy of eyewitness identifications. First would be the double-blind procedure. A double-blind lineup is one in which neither the administrator nor the eyewitness knows who the suspect is. This prevents the administrator of the lineup from providing intentional verbal or nonverbal cues to influence the eyewitness to pick the suspect. Second is instructions. Instructions are a series of statements issued by the lineup administrator to the eyewitness that deter the eyewitness from feeling compelled to make a selection. One of the recommended instructions includes the directive that the suspect may or may not be present in the lineup. Third is confidence statements. Immediately following the lineup procedure, the eyewitness should provide a statement in his or her own words that articulates the level of confidence he or she has made of the identification made. Therefore, I was able to talk about how memory can be unreliable.
As you move on, the mist of this landscape has been almost entirely lifted. You spot a bridge to the north. It will carry you over the river, it seems. As you approach the bridge, you notice that you have a better vantage point of everything that came before: the trail near the water, the forest, the columns, your starting place. At first, you didn't know where you were, but now you have a slightly better idea thanks to the monuments, characters, and stories that seem to hover over the land you are beginning to remember. You climb onto the bridge and look all throughout this immense plain you're situated in. You are beginning to remember. This place looks more than familiar. It is you, it is us. In navigating these ruins, we have encountered ourselves. We have charted our own path through the fragments of the past. Memory is a ruin, and we have the tools to decide how these ruins are mediated, how they live their lives beyond an irretrievable past. How will you reckon with the presence of memory? What will you do when you cross the bridge?
Game over!